Good afternoon. We will be starting momentarily. Payroll Compliance Webinar. I am Carlos Garcia, Product Manager for Payroll Applications here at Accountants World, and your host for this webinar. The webinar broadcasts audio over PC speakers, or you may use our teleconference number. The two major components of compliance are payments and forms. Today we'll talk about setup as far as payments, monitoring payments, payment options, what types of payments we have, ACH credit versus ACH debit, non-sufficient funds. And as far as forms, we'll also look at some setup and guidelines for proper forms compliance, filing methods. We'll talk about form rejections, archiving compliance forms, and multi-state allocation. We will also briefly go over the EFT application process, and then we will focus on managing compliance on a large scale, sort of like a service bureau type. We will wrap up with the program resources and some compliance FAQs or frequently asked questions. This is the employer tax information screen. The state account numbers entered here or better yet, the tax payments are scheduled based on the employer's tax frequency, which is issued by the taxing authority. Okay, it is imperative that this is set up correctly from the very beginning and evaluated every year at year end. We have seen many cases where employers have been penalized for not using the proper tax deposit frequency. Another critical area is using the proper account ID numbers. These are used to properly identify payments. It is very important that you do not use bogus numbers. The state account numbers entered in the employer tax information screen flow to the e-services taxes screen. Many states will use the same identification number for electronic purposes. Should a state require a different EFT ID number, like for example, New York, simply click on the state line to access an additional screen where you will find the state requirement link, any forms if applicable, and where you may enter a different account number. Today, Payroll Relief supports 80% of states for electronic filing and about 90% of the states for electronic fund transfers. The employer dashboard has a pane for taxes due through the end of the current quarter. Please take note of the text at the bottom of the pane that states that if filed early, will be debited on the file date. This applies to both tax payments when you select pay early or forms that are filed earlier than the due date. Another important pane in the employer dashboard to monitor payments is the funds required. This shows for any given day funds required in employer's bank account for electronic payments of taxes, child support, and direct deposit. Valuable information indeed. You may also monitor all the employer detailed pending payments from this screen and the schedule payment method. This is the employer's tax payment pending payment screen, and the last column shows the payment method. When clicking on a particular line item, you may have the following payment options. You may either pay early, disable EFT, or pay a different amount. Okay. The program is designed to make payments in a timely manner. Therefore, these options should be the exception. For example, if a client advises you that they either do not have the funds or have limited funds for a particular tax payment, you may either disable EFT or pay that different amount. You need to always keep in mind that a payment not made in a timely manner or for an amount less than the liability due will incur penalty and interest. So you definitely do not want to overuse this feature. Another monitoring screen for payments is the payments made screen for the employer. Here you can monitor payments made for a particular period, and if payment was manual, notice that there's a link where you can now reprint the payment coupon. This is a suggested enhancement that many of you had in the past. We added it recently. You can now reprint a coupon for a manual payment. A feature available in payroll relief is pre-funding. Okay. Employers that wish to be debited for payroll taxes on the pay date may opt to use the pre-funding option. Okay. This screen in particular allows you to monitor amounts pre-funded. It's sort of a reconciliation or statement of pre-funding. The three main columns are amount pre-funded, amount credited, which means already paid to the taxing authority, and balance, which is amounts that have been pre-funded but have not yet been released. Okay. 3 quick points on pre-funding. Only tax payments that can be made via electronic fund transfers will be pre-funded. Secondly, both the use EFT and the use pre-funding checkboxes must be enabled. And thirdly, all pending liabilities with the same due date will be pre-funded. For example, a monthly tax depositor. Okay. Let's say runs a payroll with a pay date of October 9th today. Pre-funding is not enabled. This liability is now due November 15th, and it's not pre-funded because pre-funding is not enabled. I now enable pre-funding, and I run the next payroll with a pay date of October 23rd. Those liabilities are also due on November 15th, so the customer at that point will be debited for both payroll liabilities, October 9th and October 23rd. Okay, so please be careful. If you're going to use the pre-funding option, leave it on. Turning it on and turning it off and turning it back on is not advisable and could lead to problems. Let's talk about the 2 different types of payments. ACH credit is where the system debits the bank account entered in the system for the employer. Funds are placed in a fiduciary account until cleared, and then the system sends the credit to the taxing agency with the due date as the settlement date, and if pay early that's provided that pay early has not been requested. ACH debit, on the contrary, is when the system sends the bank information entered in the system to the taxing agency, and then the taxing agency directly debits the employer's bank account. The debit date is at the taxing agency's discretion. We have no control over when the agency will debit the employer's bank account. Non-sufficient funds. Okay. An area of high concern is NSS and how to avoid them. We cannot say it enough. Only take fiscally responsible clients, or better yet, do not use e-services for clients that are not fiscally responsible or experience continual cash flow problems. Okay, non-sufficient funds are the number 2 problem we see in e-services after bogus account numbers. Okay, and the non-sufficient funds that we see the most are for taxes, followed by direct deposit, client billing, and bank validations. Okay, these are labor intensive and they're an inconvenience to you, your client, and us. Multiple NSFs will affect the client and your firm. It is not only your reputation here at hand, but also your legal responsibility to fund these NSFs. So in the case of an NSF, you will be contacted via email, and you need to contact the employer and make sure to fund that non-sufficient fund. Okay, so here at the left, I have from the IRS Publication 15, the penalties for paying late. And as you can see, they're pretty stiff. So how do you avoid NSFs? Well, first of all, you want to talk to your clients and help them to understand how important it is to plan properly and allocate funds for tax payments. Okay, defaulting on tax payments is not cost effective. Penalties plus the interest can quickly add up. Okay, plus NSF fees and the time labor costs addressing these NSFs. Do you know that the IRS will apply any deposit to the most recent liability, leaving the older unpaid liabilities accumulating yet more interest and a stiffer penalty? The IRS collects millions of dollars in late payment penalties and interest every year. A history of NSFs will jeopardize the client's credit and your reputation. E-services will be disabled, and eventually the ACH application will be frozen. In addition to receiving an email, you may monitor non-sufficient fund situations at the bottom of the employer dashboard. There's a pane for returns and rejections. Okay, so these are all the different ways that you may monitor tax payments. Let's talk about forms now. We'll talk about some setup because there it also is important. We'll talk about the different filing methods, what happens with rejections, how to archive compliance forms, and a recent enhancement that we added for multi-state allocation. Again, we find ourselves at the employer tax information screen. Okay. Having the proper tax payment frequency is not only important for payments, some state forms may depend on your tax deposit frequency. With regard to the federal forms, the system defaults to the quarterly 941. However, the employer may be required to file an annual 944 or 943. Here again, it is critical to use proper account ID numbers. These are used to properly identify the employer filing the form. One very important fact about using bogus account numbers. 80% of the rejections that we see are due to invalid account numbers. Either bogus or numbers transposed, or they're just not valid account numbers. Some additional settings to note on this screen are where you can mark the employer FUTA exempt or pseudo exempt in the case of nonprofit organizations. You can opt to pay your FUTA quarterly, and you can indicate that the employer is a seasonal employer. So let's continue with the form setup, which is also an important part of compliance. You can use the compliance preferences screen to review and set up any employer preferences. 3 items to point out here are, first, additional form information such as change of address, final return, preparer and third-party designee can be indicated here. If you want to force a refund, okay, the system does default to applying an overpayment on a particular form. If it's in the first 3 quarters of the year, you can opt to force a refund in that situation. And thirdly, the tax agency checks option, which allows you to print a check through payroll relief for any manual payments that you may have. Before we cover form filing methods, be aware that in order to e-file federal forms, you need to be a reporting agent and have Form 8655 in the process status, as indicated here on the screen. If you have not had the chance to attend our e-services webinar, I encourage you to view the electronic services training video found in the program's resources section, or at the top of the EFT application screen right here with that little blue circle and the white triangle. Also very informative are two documents in the ACH application screen related actions area. One is the overview of e-services and the other the EFT application process. Okay, filing methods. In pay relief, you may either record the form as paper filed, meaning you printed and mailed it, or you can e-file. The best program feature with regard to compliance is Auto e-file. It is the accountant's best friend. Okay. Auto e-file is a process whereby eligible forms are electronically filed automatically starting in the second half of the compliance month. So let's talk about the auto file process. At the beginning of the month, your forms are ready to be e-filed. Okay. At this time, and you probably already have done so, you will receive an auto e-file reminder email, which should prompt you to start your review process for all client records. Starting in the second half of the month, or after the 15th, the auto e-file function will run daily until all forms have been e-filed, allowing enough lead time for the processing of any ACH credit payments that are due with the forms. It is imperative that you advise your clients that balance due amounts can be debited any time after the 15th of the month, and therefore they should have those funds available in the bank account. We strongly recommend that you use on a daily basis the available tools in the program to manage compliance, and we'll cover these in the managing compliance section later on. So we talked about the filing methods. Let's talk about monitoring forms. Okay. And we'll talk a little bit more about auto e-file later. The employer dashboard is one place where you may monitor any past due forms or rejections at the bottom right of the screen. Please know that if a form is rejected, you will be notified by email as well. If addressed in a timely manner, you correct the situation, any issues, and you manually re-file the form. The tax form screen shows forms and their status for a specific period. We see here that the NYS 45, the last form, was rejected. Now, clicking on the form name, NYS 45, will bring up a dialog box with the rejection error, as well as an area to attach notes to the form. Okay, so as you can see, there are several ways to monitor tax forms filed, and rejections are: 1, email, 2, you have the employer dashboard, and 3, you have this tax form screen at the employer level. And there's yet one more that we'll discuss later. An integral part of the compliance process is to archive tax forms. One way that you may archive forms at the employer level is from the tax form screen. Okay. Click the cloud icon at the bottom of the screen and make sure that the status is in set to all forms. Okay. We will cover much more on this and a much more efficient way of doing so later. A recent enhancement that we added to the program was the ability to set up at the employee level allocation percentages for those employees that are multi-state. Okay. Notice that as a default, both percentages are 100%. Okay. The reason here is because previously this is how the system would function. If an employee had 2 states, it would tax 100% of the wages for each state. Okay. Now you have the ability to change this. Okay. But you have to be careful because there are many different scenarios depending on state regulations. So let's take a look at one example. In this screen, our employee Paul lives and works in New York. However, he performs 25% of his work in New Jersey and wishes to be withheld New Jersey taxes. New York, being his resident state and a state that requires 100% of the wages to be reported regardless of where earned, would be left at 100%. New Jersey may now be changed to 25%. So with this setup, if Paul earns $2,000 in the pay period, $2,000 would be used for New York withholding and reported on the NYS 45. On the other hand, only 500, 25%, would be used for New Jersey withholding and reported on the NJ 927 form. His W-2 would have $2,000 in state wages for New York and $500 in state wages for New Jersey, along with each state's respective withholding. Okay. Now, this is just an example. You need to be careful how you use these allocation percentages depending on the state requirements, again, for reporting and withholding taxes. So let's talk about what happens when you file a form with a balance due. And we're going to start with the number 1 scenario, that is that all e-services are enabled. Okay. So if the form is, if the form payment is to be processed ACH credit, what happens is the form gets e-filed. At that time, the payment gets scheduled, debited 4 banking days prior to the due date, and then credited to the tax agency on the due date. If it's an ACH debit payment, okay, I can think of Connecticut, for example, Maryland, the form gets e-filed with the bank information and the amount due, and then the tax agency debits the amount from the employer's bank account. Let's take that same scenario, but now the client is using pre-funding. Okay, same thing, if ACH credit, the form gets e-filed. Now the pre-funded amounts are released to the tax agency when the form is filed, not on the due date, when the form is filed. Now, if there's a situation where the balance is under pre-funded, an additional debit will be processed at that time for the difference. If it's over pre-funded, then a refund to the employer is scheduled. Okay. An example of this could be with the unemployment forms. If the rate changes during the quarter, there may be an under withholding or under a pre-funded or over pre-funded situation. So it's important that you need to understand how that works. If the form is an ACH debit, then pre-funding is not supported for those states because, once again, it's the tax agency that's debiting the tax from the employer's bank account directly. And there's many other combinations which we do not have enough time to cover in detail, but I can just mention them quickly here. One of them is e-file is not supported, but EFT is supported. That means the form is paper filed, mailed, and the balance is processed ACH credit. Okay. Obviously, it can't be processed ACH debit because the form is not e-filed. Let's say the e-file is supported, but the EFT is not supported. In that case, the form gets electronically filed, and either if you're using the tax agency check printing option, a payment will be scheduled so that you can print that check and coupon and mail it with the form. And if not, then the payment is directly recorded. Okay. And it's the third situation is where everything's manual, no EFT, no e-file is supported. Then you do everything paper. It is very important, and I cannot say this enough, that if a manual payment is made, that you record it in the system. Okay, that's why it's best to use electronic services, because the system handles everything. When you have manual processes, now you need to manually tell the system that you made that payment by recording the payment. Another scenario is when a form is filed with an overpayment. Okay. So here we have a federal Form 941 for the third quarter that has a $119 overpayment applied. Okay. It's very important for you to know that not until the form is recorded as filed will the system begin to apply an overpayment to any future liabilities. Okay, so for example, I have recorded my 941 as filed. Therefore, when we look at the details of the monthly federal tax payment for pay date October 11, okay, which is due on November 15th, we see that the overpayment column shows an amount of $119 that has been applied, and the pending payment has been reduced by that amount. I need to reiterate, because a lot of times we get a call, I know I have an overpayment from prior quarter, why isn't my liability being reduced? And 9 out of 10 times it's because the form has not been recorded, therefore the overpayment does not exist in the system, for lack of better terms. Okay, before we get into the second half of our presentation, let's take a quick detour and talk about the EFT application process, which we just revamped, which is also an important aspect of payrolling. We recently streamlined the process for our eServices EFT application, and this is also covered in the eServices training video. A major part of that streamline was to remove the need to download the application, send it to the client, have the client sign it, have the client scan it, have the client send it back to us, and finally upload the application through the program. Now we have a convenient wizard that can be emailed to your client that consists of 4 entry screens. In this first screen that we're looking at here, the client enters their business information. Okay. Before we move on, let's take a quick look at the email that I'm talking about. Now, you can do this process in your office if you have the client with you. You can just go through the program and do the process there. Or if you want to email the employer, at the bottom of the screen, just click on Email Employer. You get the pop-up that says Begin a new EFT application. And I understand that this will reset the application. You click Send, and this is the email that your client receives with your logo, and it says, we have partnered with Accountants World, a third-party service provider, to offer electronic fund transfer services as part of our payroll program. Using EFT allows us to process your business payroll and tax payments electronically, and then it goes on, and then as you can see, it has click application for electronic fund transfers. When the client clicks on that link, okay, it takes them directly to that first screen, and there is no login needed. Okay. In screen number 2, now the client may log into their bank, select the account that they want to use, verify it, and validate. bank information fields will automatically populate from having logged into their bank account. Once the bank information has been entered and obtained, better yet, the client electronically signs the EFT application in screen 3. Okay, so as you can see here, blank enters the name, and then at the bottom, signed. In screen 4, it presents the completed and signed application to the client, where they may print it for their copy, a copy for their files. However, what's more important here is that the client confirms at the top of the screen that they are authorized to sign the legal binding agreement. Okay. Once this is done, the client's part of the process is completed. Now back to the program, you, the payroll processing provider, complete and electronically sign your part of the application. And the last screen provides a summary of where in the process you are. So here, for example, for rigid manufacturing, everything has been completed, and right now the application is processing. Okay, now to the second half of our headache-free compliance webinar. This is where the real headache-free comes into play, so please pay close attention. So far, we have covered compliance from a single client perspective. This may be beneficial if you happen to be in that client, or perhaps you have given client access to certain or some compliance areas. However, we know that you have many clients, and this approach is not practical or efficient for managing all your clients' compliance. So you want to be able to, as a whole, manage e-file, manage the due and past due forms, manage tax payments, manage your pseudo rates, your client notifications, as well as archive payments and forms. Managing compliance for a large firm is quite cumbersome. This is why Payroll Relief is the only program in the market that provides you with the best tools for managing and analyzing your payroll compliance at the firm or service bureau level. This is important because you want to make certain that you have at a high level a documented process to use these tools as controls in the compliance area. Okay, headache-free compliance, managing compliance. Have a process, have a document to cover what we're about to discuss in the second half of this webinar. These tools are all found under the Payroll Center menu under Manage Compliance Reports. The first 3 tabs are associated with forms. As mentioned earlier, at the beginning of the compliance month, you receive an auto e-file reminder email. Basically, at this time, your forms are ready to be e-filed. However, we strongly recommend that you review the exceptions screen to learn which forms will not be or have not been auto e-filed due to an exception. Okay. If you notice, this screen provides the client code, the name, the form, and the exception details so that you can correct them and hopefully re-e-file the form. Okay, so very important screen. You can select all the employers or just one, period end date, and you can look at a particular state if you have multiple states, or you can look at all your states. The rejection screen provides similar information and the rejection reason. All these screens have the ability for you to view all employers or a particular employer, and if applicable, to select a period and a state. With the Forms Due screen, you may view past due or forms currently due. Those are the radio buttons on the top left. Also take note at the bottom that all these screens may be exported to Excel. Okay. So that's managing your tax forms. 3 different tabs. Let's look at managing tax payments. This pending tax payment screen is our most recently added managing tool. Okay, actually, it replaces the former manage taxes screen. This enhanced version depicts a much more comprehensive view regarding tax payments. Okay. If you notice, you can view payments due, past due payments, or all payments. Again, radio buttons at the top left of the screen. In addition to the client code and name, the grid itself shows tax agency, payment type, related form, what the amount is, debit date if applicable, due date, and the payment method. Okay. There are 3 types of payment methods: manual, EFT, and direct debit. Okay. The latter one is a new method that we added to differentiate between ACH credit and ACH debit. So EFT is ACH credit, direct debit is ACH debit. Okay, this is visible here on this screen as well as the individual pending payment screen at the employer level. The SUTA rate screen, added at the beginning of this year, provides pertinent information about the employer's SUTA rates. This screen, as well as the next one that we'll be looking at, are probably used more at year-end to review setup information that may need to be changed in order to stay in compliance. Available here are SUTA rate, effective date, and the unemployment account number, which, as mentioned earlier, is important for unemployment forms, filing, and payments. Okay. So all your clients, here at a glance, you can review their rates and SUTA information. And the next screen, which is your federal look back or managing your federal tax deposit frequency. For every employer, there are columns for each quarter's liability in the look back period. Okay. So let's take a look at the first 2 clients. The first client, AA Pre-Funding, we see that the total tax for the look-back period is $85,000, and their current frequency is set at monthly. So we know right off that that is wrong, okay, because it's over $50,000 and they need to be semi-weekly. Looking at the second client, we see that they're okay because they're semi-weekly already. Okay. Simply by reviewing the last 2 columns, I may identify any non-compliant employers. And this is very important. Because again, we've seen many cases where clients, employers are getting notices and sometimes penalties because they're using the improper frequency. Okay, moving right along. Client communication is always important, more so during compliance periods. Payroll Relief features a client notification blast email functionality under the firm administration menu. You simply select the clients that you wish to notify and click on the email icon. From the screen, you can either send one of our preset canned emails or create your own custom email. Let's select, for example, quarterly compliance reports, halfway down the list. Okay. Now you can see the actual body of the email, and then you simply click send email to send to all the selected employers. Very powerful tool here for communicating with your clients. Another part of client communication built into the program are the tax due and forms due reminder emails. Make sure that these are selected in the firm administration email options. And remember that state unemployment forms do have confidential Social Security number information. Therefore, we strongly recommend that you use the option for a secure password protection and enter a password in the employer options screen. Okay. I know there's new regulations this year. The federal government has permitted now the masking of Social Security numbers. We need to follow up with the states to see if that's going to happen as well with the unemployment forms. It would be nice to see that because, again, they do provide the list of all the employees and their Social Security numbers, which is really not very secure. Lastly, and many of you may not know this, you may opt to have the client receive text messages for pay date and tax due reminders. Okay. Simply select the option at the bottom of the eServices preference screen, text notifications, and your client will receive text notifications that look something like this. Okay. This is a straight picture from my iPhone. And you can see the last two, one's a payday reminder and the other one's a payroll tax notification. Yet another way to communicate with clients about tax compliance matters. Okay, we briefly showed how to archive forms at the employer level. But again, we're talking about a lot of employers here. So under batch processing, there's an option to archive forms. You have the ability to batch archive all filed or recorded forms. Simply select the period, all the clients you wish to archive by checking the box, and click on the cloud icon at the bottom of the screen. If selected, this process will also email a password-protected zip file to the client. Please take note that the employer should have a password in the employer options. Okay, that's what that first column is. In this particular case, on this screen, I don't know if you can make it out, but only the second employer, CHG Multi-State Corporation, has that box checked for password, so only they will be receiving an email with a zip file, password protected. Also remember that under batch processing, the program does offer the ability to batch archive all filed W-2s and 1099s as well. Okay. Moving along with archiving compliance information, you may also archive individual reports in the compliance report section by clicking on the icon at the bottom of the screen, the cloud icon. You may want to use a custom-built compliance report set to archive. And ACH transactions, specifically taxes, are an important part of compliance. You may either archive our new ACH report found under the employer reports, which shows ACH transactions by category. So we see here we have billing, child support, direct deposit. At the very bottom, we have taxes. These are all ACH transactions. Or you can use the export feature in the ACH transaction screen under eServices, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Down the stretch here, context-sensitive help. At any screen in the program, you may simply click on the question mark in the upper right-hand corner to access help text for that particular screen. Payroll Relief has a comprehensive set of resources to help you with your payroll compliance. Here we're looking at the employment forms section, which provides 3 different areas where all state and federal forms or links are available for new hire forms, employer forms, and employee forms. Okay. There are also many other resources available to you, as you can see from the drop-down menu on the resources. You have training videos, support documents, employment forms, which we're looking at, forms and publications, links, tools, webinars, and marketing resources, all payroll-related material. Okay. Within Payroll Relief resources, you can enjoy access to previous webinars. And also, please make sure to always check the program's announcements for any notifications or enhancements. With regard to compliance, We do announce any new forms or any e-file added, any electronic fund transfers added, as well as remind you of important tasks or upcoming events. So it's also more important so during compliance periods to be aware of these announcements. And don't forget our helpful program tips at the bottom of this screen. Okay, so speaking about announcements, I have a question for all of you. What have we said is Payroll Relief's best compliance feature? Okay, and I know I made a point to emphasize it because we feel very strongly about it. Payroll Relief's best compliance feature is, hold on a second, sorry about that. Auto e-file. Okay, so along with that, we have an announcement, and that is that in January 2020, we will be auto e-filing all unfiled federal W-2s and state equivalent forms. Okay. What's the process? Well, the system will start to auto e-file of these forms the last week in January, giving you the opportunity and the time to review and e-file yourself during the first 3 weeks of the year. And don't forget that batch e-file is available for W-2s. Okay. During the last week of January, the system will e-file the federal W-2s followed by any state W-2 transmittal forms if applicable. The goal is that the process will be completed by January 31st, 2020. So some of you may be asking, why are we doing this? We're doing this because we know that our audience are accountants, and we know that you are focusing on getting your payroll compliance done in January so that you can move on to tax season. And although many of you are diligent and do record or e-file your W-2s, we have found in the past that some of you don't, even though you did mail them in the case of recording, because if you had e-filed them, then the system would automatically record them. So in order to prevent this, we are going to auto e-file the forms for you at the end of January. Okay, let's take a quick look at some compliance FAQs. The first one is, why has my EFT application not been approved? There's a number of reasons. You could be missing the client or the accountant's signature, the application could be incomplete, or you have not set up any employees with direct deposit. Another question is, why are some tax payments paid electronically 3 banking days before the due date, when all over your system it is stated that 4 banking days are required? Okay. Please keep in mind that if a payment is made electronically within a 3 banking day window, it's only a courtesy. Okay, there is no guarantee that the tax payments will be processed via EFT. It all depends on timing, which I'm not going to get into right now. But if there is enough timing to pick up that payment, the system will pick it up and send it. If there isn't, then it will not be paid electronically. So to be safe, follow the 4 banking day rule. Another question that we get a lot is, I have auto e-file enabled, yet my tax form was not auto e-filed. Why? Well, you need to check the exceptions report, which we mentioned. Maybe there's a pending payment that hasn't been made, and therefore the form cannot be filed until that payment is made. Or there's missing or incorrect information on the form. I need to unfile an electronically filed form. Why can't I? Well, like we always say, it's like dropping a form in the mailbox, okay? It cannot be retrieved. And this is a question that, believe it or not, we get a lot. And unfortunately, we cannot unfile an electronically filed form. These forms are submitted throughout the day, and there's no guarantee whether we can catch it or not catch it. And again, it's like dropping it in the mailbox. My client's unemployment rate changed, and they are using pre-funding. What happens with the excess or deficit? We've kind of briefly talked about this. The excess will be refunded. The deficit is debited at the time of filing. Okay, the refund is also scheduled at the time of filing. So filing is the triggering event. When you file the form, that triggers the either refund or the additional debit. Why does the pending payment for unemployment form show a different amount than what is actually due on the form? We touched upon this briefly as well. Change in the unemployment rate during the quarter, or perhaps you had a prior quarter adjustment that you entered in the tax form screen on the dialog box that I showed you when you click on the form name. Debit date says 4 banking days before the due date. Why was the client debited earlier? Well, it's either it was a coupon payment where you requested pay early, or as noted earlier in the webinar under the dashboard and in the taxes due pane, the form was filed early. And if the form is filed early, you're requesting pay early. Again, that you can follow that concept that it's like putting it in the mailbox with the check. Okay, you mailed it on October 10th. That's when it's got paid and that's when it got mailed. And the last question is, tax forms are not scheduled for a client. Why? The answer to that is because there's no payrolls that have been processed in the current year. Okay, keep in mind, payroll relief is a live payroll program. The assumption here is that you're using the program and you are processing recurring payrolls on a systematic schedule. If you are a seasonal employer, the system does recognize that and will generate 0 return forms. Same thing if you didn't have one in the prior quarter, but you didn't have any payroll, it will generate forms for the following quarter. Only if you didn't have any payrolls in the entire year, that would be a problem. It will not schedule forms. So summarizing what we have talked about today in managing compliance headache-free, we covered all that is about payments, the setup, the monitoring of payments, the payment options, the payment types. We discussed non-sufficient funds and what happens. Same thing with forms. We talked about setup and guidelines, filing methods, rejections, archiving forms. We touched upon the multi-state allocation, which is a new enhancement that we recently added. We covered the EFT application process in a quick manner. We talked about managing at a high level all your clients, and we're managing e-file, we're managing due and past due forms, we're managing tax payments. Can't say it enough. This is a new screen and it's very powerful. Managing SUTA rates, your client notifications as a way to communicate with your clients during compliance months and other times in the year, and the importance of archival of the payments and the forms. And lastly, we talked about the resources in the program help, all the publications and employment forms available to you, as well as other resources like training videos, links, tools, webinars, and so forth. Just a reminder that registration for payroll relief training webinars are posted on the firm portal page. And I do want to thank you for attending Payroll Relief Headache-Free Compliance webinar. Good luck for the remaining of the year as we wind down 2019 and get ready for year-end. Our webinar for year-end compliance will be scheduled later on. There will be one in December and most likely one at the beginning of January. Again, thank you for attending today's webinar. And thank you for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to attend the webinar, knowing that tomorrow, or no, next week, is October 15th, so you're probably busy with your tax returns on extension. But we hope that this webinar was worth it and you found it very helpful and informative.
Hi, Carlos. That was a great webinar. There were a few questions that, well, some are rolling in now. And there was one at the very, very top. As if you scroll down, you'll see one that wasn't answered.
get there. Hold on a second.
What about, yeah, Linda asked, what about when a state withholding form needs to be filed, but there has been no tax withheld for the reporting period?
That would be a zero tax return.
Right. Now,
If it's mandatory, and most states are going that route, then the system will generate a form, a zero return.
but does it generate it automatically? Don't they have to run a $0 payroll, right?
No, it generates it automatically if it's one of the states that we are aware of that requires a zero return. If it's the state that perhaps just invoked that ruling or that we're not aware of, then yes, in that case you're right. You would have to run a zero payroll to generate the form, but that shouldn't be the case. Like I said, we do have a list of states that require zero returns, and we do generate those zero forms.
Okay. Because Katrina was asking, this is now towards the end, she's asking that she's got a situation where employees work, I guess they have state taxes that need to be debited or need to be, the employer has state taxes per hour that need to be deducted. And she can't run, let me see, she actually said something else before that.
My question was the exact same thing with states that require reports with no wages withheld, and the forms will not populate. I would definitely, if that's the case, I would definitely suggest that Katrina calls support, and we can address that, see what the state is and what the form is and why it's not generating or not populating.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like the form is generating but not populating, so.
Okay, because one thing I was suggesting to her is to run $0 payroll, but then she says that then she's going to be charged for it.
No, I would suggest you call support and we address the matter and to find out what state it is and what form it is, and then we can take it from there.
Okay.
Dorina had a question about multi-state allocation. Basically, it's just in the employee setup, once you assign a second state to the employee, you will see those allocation percentage boxes. They'll both default to 100%, and then you can change those percentages according to what you want or what the employee has asked for. And then that would calculate the state wages, and then those state wages will carry to the respective forms. So like in my example that I used during the presentation, it was New York, New Jersey, 25% for New Jersey. Person made $2,000, so 500 state wages would show up on the NJ 927, whereas 2,000 state wages would show up on the NYS 45 for that particular employee. So it's just an allocation of the state wages, and then also when it calculates the paycheck, it uses those allocated wages to compute the withholding tax. Whereas before, when you didn't have those allocation percentages, it would always use 100% for both states. Okay. And one thing that I didn't mention, because it's really not compliance related as far as forms and state wages carrying to the forms, but more payroll processing related, which would be covered in the payroll processing webinar, is that allocation that you set up at the employee level can be overwritten when you're entering a payroll. So back to the example that I used, the employee is 100% New York, 25% New Jersey, but for a particular payroll, that percentage changed to maybe 60-40. You can override those percentages at the time of the payroll when you go into the payroll processing screen. Question about Meredith, about where you choose the password for secured emails. You go under the gear, under employer options, and at the bottom of that screen, you can enter the password there, and that would be the password that would be used. So it doesn't really choose it. You just enter whatever password you want, and you just enter that in the employer options.
Will forms,
Um,
W-2 forms with ITIN numbers be sent electronically?
ITIN numbers are individual taxpayer identification numbers. That's what ITIN stands for. And individual taxpayer identification numbers start with a 9, and as per SSA regulations, those W-2s cannot be sent electronically. That's in writing, specifically in the publication for W-2EF that the Social Security Administration issues. That's one of the Social Security numbers that they say that you cannot file if it starts with a 9. Another one is if it starts with 666, and there's a couple of other ones, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, obviously. But definitely that you cannot file. Technically, those individuals are not authorized to work in the United States, or else they would have a Social Security number or another number that does not start with 9.
Laura, if on the EFT application, if the employer doesn't have login, then the only way to verify the account is via using the pre-note method, which we debit the account, and the next business day you ask the employer, or the employer goes in and looks at his bank account and finds out how much money came out, was debited, would be amount under $1, and then you come back to Pay Relief and you plug that amount in, and that's how his bank account will be verified if he doesn't have a username and password to somehow to log in. He'd have to contact his bank, of course. I guess he wouldn't even be able to see that information.
Hannah Perez has a question. Is the Social Security number failed verification on W-2 form still eligible to e-file? Don't know why you would want to file a W-2 with an invalid Social Security number or a Social Security number that has failed verification, but you can. Well, more than likely the employer will receive a notice from the Social Security Administration regarding this. And I did read a recent article that they are now going to enforce this a lot more,
Right?
and they're coming after employers, for filing Social Security numbers that have failed the verification system. So I would recommend that you would find out why it's failing and address it from that point, than just trying to e-file it with a failed verification.
Caitlin, I think you might want to, like Carlos said before, you might want to touch base with support on, you're saying that Virginia requires a $0 return for income tax withholding. That's income tax withholding, right? Not, but you said called VA5, and Pay Relief has not generated that form. Pay Relief doesn't generate any, as far as I know, it doesn't generate any income tax withholding forms, only payroll forms.
No, I think what she's saying is if it's a 0, I can't remember right now if the VA5 is a coupon or an actual form, but if it's a coupon, okay, I believe the system does generate a VA5 0 coupon, but what we cannot do, and this is per NACHA, is we cannot send a 0 payment through NACHA.
Oh,
So
I
I don't
see.
know, I'm assuming it's a Natchez thing, not a Virginia thing, because I think there's the same problem we have with other states. I think Maryland's another state, where the employer is supposed to file a zero coupon, but we cannot do it electronically. That's a system limitation, and I don't believe any payroll provider can do that, is file a zero EFT, ACH transaction.
Yeah, well, she's saying that it's a $0 return for income tax. She probably meant $0 return for payroll tax withholding, not income tax, right? Because income tax is the 1040 or 1120.
Chris Bryant posed a good question. He said, "Do you think Accountswell will ever handle the local tax payments?" I'm assuming that you meant electronically.
Yeah.
That is something that I am hopeful myself that we will do. Right now, the only ones that we do electronically, and that's because they're part of the NYS1 coupon, is the New York City and the Yonkers. Um, but the Oregon was another one that it comes to mind that we also do the transit tax. Um, so we do some, obviously not Ohio and Pennsylvania, which are the main big states with a lot of locals. Um, but that's something that I'm hopeful. However, like Roger said, not likely at the moment, but down the road perhaps.
The batch compliance does the archiving of all the forms for that quarter, correct, Carlos?
Yes, all the forms that have been filed.
For that quarter. Now, you can't select which forms, and those will go into the included cloud cabinet of payroll relief.
That's correct. I'm curious to know why you would only archive some and not all the tax forms, since they're all compliance related.
Mm-hmm. Susanna said the client overpaid deposit on the NYS1 for the second quarter.
Yeah, I'm
She
looking
doesn't
at that.
see. Yeah.
Yeah, manual, if you enter something in manual payments, all it does is it goes to the deposits line of the tax form that you indicated. So, it could be possible that you used the wrong period end date. So if you overpaid it in the second quarter, you want to apply it to the third quarter. So if you entered the overpaid amount and you indicated period end date 6/30, that's probably why it didn't cover over to the third quarter NYS 45. Um, so I would take a look at that. I think that's the problem there, because yes, anything that you enter in the what they call external payments is the name of the screen. Um, it goes directly to the deposits line on the form. So it could be possible also, as I'm talking, that I realize that New York, because it has New York State, New York City, New York Yonkers, that we don't know what additional payment you're making, so it might not even work with New York. Actually, the more I think about it, the more sure I am that it does not work in New York because of that reason. Same thing with Oregon. You know, when you have a form that has multiple taxes and you're entering an additional payment, right now there's no way to indicate, you know, in New York, in that external payment screen, when you do that, it'll just say New York withholding, but it won't say whether it's city, whether it's state, or whether it's Yonkers. So it won't be, it's not supported. So, but I would call support because there is perhaps another way that maybe you can get it in on line 6 or 8 of the NYS 45, but I think that's for unemployment, that's not for withholding, so never mind.
Yeah, I think Meredith just answered or added some clarity to her question. She said, I want to download those forms to each client's file individually. We don't have Cloud Cabinet. I mean, you have an included Cloud Cabinet, but you have access to it. But those forms that are filed, you can send a zip copy to the employer.
Well, another thing you can do is when you're on the tax form screen and you're viewing the forms in PDF, you can save that PDF to a disk or to a USB drive or whatever. You can save the PDF. The PDF that's presented to you as all the forms that you selected in the tax form screen. So that would be a way to do it if you don't have Cloud Cabinet. Okay, I'm gonna go off the air now. I once again thank you for participating in this webinar, and stay tuned for our next webinar, which most likely will be the year end. Again, we usually do that in the third week of December or second week in December, and we try to do one at the very beginning of the year, if possible. Thank you, Roger, for your help.
Thank you, Carlos.